Classic markets. Classic markets of the early 20th century included illegal activities such as smuggling, prostitution, extortion, theft, and swindling, as well as larger markets like moneylending and gambling. Special markets. Special markets often arise from political events, culture, and local regulations. For example, the black market that occurred during the alcohol prohibition era in the United States made many large Italian-American families rich in cities such as Chicago, New York, and many others. This market also allowed these families and their relatives to sometimes take over the roles of organized Irish and Jewish criminal groups using violence like the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Criminal interconnected networks. Italian groups established beneficial and profitable relationships with Asian criminal groups on the West Coast. As a result, they gained access to Asian markets and new opportunities that arose, such as the opium trade in China led by English companies, and gambling in the then Portuguese colony of Macau and the then Dutch East Indies. In contrast, the world's doors were opened to the Chinese triad through Portugal and the Netherlands. Industrial Revolution. Organized crime groups respond powerfully to major political events and skillfully manipulate their power balance to adapt to existing circumstances. In the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution, through the control of money, weapons, and global trade, created new power balances and witnessed significant changes in the operations of the largest and most active groups, such as Italian gangs, Yakuza, triads, and Russians. The industrialization process is evident in the illegal activities of Irish and Jewish organized crime groups and is referred to as America's wealthy artisans in the 18th century. The connection between wealthy industrialists and organized crime groups can also be seen in Britain, France, Italy, and China. Countries where the underground power of organized crime groups was provided to the government to implement economic strategies by controlling people through violence. The Industrial Revolution also led to massive global migration, particularly from Europe to the United States and colonies to Britain. Multinational criminal groups. This massive migration resulted in a shift in the balance of power among criminal groups. In America, the powerful Italian, Irish, and Polish families rose to prominence, while in Britain, the Chinese, Irish, and Indian families gained influence. During this period, illegal markets included extortion, human trafficking, selling liquor, prostitution, and gambling. Jewish organized crime groups. The history of Jewish organized crime groups is intertwined with the history of Jewish migration that occurred in the 16th and 17th centuries to escape persecution and anti-Semitism across Europe. In Russia, during the Tsarist era, Jews were confined to Jewish settlements in Western Russian territories, including Poland, Ukraine, Latvia, Lithuania, and Belarus. In all major cities, Jews lived in enclosed neighborhoods, and many professions and occupations were prohibited for them. The poverty and destitution that Jews experienced led millions of them to flee to America, particularly to areas under the control of criminal gangs, many of whom were Irish. Like all immigrant communities, new criminal elements emerged that became organized crime groups in many migrant communities. Relationships with Irish and Jews. In the early 20th century, the most prominent gangsters on the eastern seaboard of America had connections with Tammany Hall, a political machine of the Democratic Party notorious for corruption and nepotism. Although the Irish primarily ran the Tammany Coalition, these organizations also included Jewish groups. One of the most powerful leaders of Tammany Hall in the late 18th century was a Jewish individual named Aaron Burr. New York City gangs. The famous Five Points Gang, led by Monk Eastman, who was born in 1873 as Edward Osterman, was one of the largest gangs in New York City. The notorious Five Points Gang was led by Paolo Vaccarelli, who preferred to use the name Paul Kelly because in New York City at that time, Irish names were more prestigious than Italian names. It is said that Al Capone was also a member of the Five Points Gang. Purple Gang. During the Prohibition era in the United States, the Purple Gang held power in Detroit, while the Capone Gang held power in Chicago. Although all organized crime groups in America were multi-ethnic, the Purple Gang was entirely Jewish. The Purple Gang, headquartered in the Lower East Side of Detroit, was involved in classic activities such as bootlegging, robbery, gambling, drug trafficking, extortion, and kidnapping. They were also involved in the notorious Detroit murders known as the Miraflores and Collingwood massacres. Some believe that the Purple Gang was also involved in the St. Valentine's Day massacre in Chicago. It was known that Raymond Bernstein and his brothers Abe, Joey, and Izzy, as well as Philip and Harry Keywell and Sam and Harry Fleischer, were the main leaders of the Purple Gang. Bernstein died in 1958 due to a heart attack. The Assassination Company. The Assassination Company is one of the largest and most successful Jewish organized crime groups. This group was at the peak of its power in the 1920s and 1930s. The activities of this group included classic illegal activities such as alcohol smuggling, gambling, extortion, and prostitution, as well as professional murder. It has now been revealed that this group killed over 1,000 people in America for a fee. For several decades, the Assassination Company was the most powerful international criminal organization in the world. Entangled stories. The story of Irish organized crime in the 20th century begins with the massive migration of Irish people who fled their homeland's troubles and sought a haven across the seas. Irish organized crime in America, even more than Italian organized crime, became an integral part of this country's history. Irish ghettos. The first wave of Irish immigrants was able to find a strong foothold in the world of crime and politics. In the early 1920s, Irish organized crime groups were the most powerful groups in America. Although they did not have a stronghold in their homeland, Irish leaders of organized crime had established strong ties with groups in Ireland that were fighting for freedom and later for independence from English rule. Irish gangs. Irish criminal groups developed in the impoverished and often illiterate ghetto neighborhoods of all American cities. However, the most famous Irish criminal organizations emerged in the East Coast regions or around New York, Boston, and Chicago. One of these organizations, the North Side Gang, also known as the North Side Mob, was almost destroyed during the St. Valentine's Day massacre. The 40 Thieves. Organized crime groups in Britain grew slowly until World War II. While American organized crime groups were thriving during the Prohibition era, the British criminal scene was dominated by two organizations called Sabini Brothers and the 40 Thieves before World War II. Italian-Scottish dominance in London. From 1918 to the start of World War II, London was under the control of a gang led by half-Italian and half-Scottish brothers Sabini. This gang, led by Charles Alano Sabini, was active in horse racing, gambling, nightclubs, and betting. After the war, an agreement was reached between one of the rival gangs, the Brummagem Boys, and the Sabini brothers over the territory of various criminal activities in the mid-1920s. This allowed the Sabini brothers to become a major force in London's underground world. The Shoplifting Gang. The gang known as 40 Thieves was unusual in the history of organized crime because it was composed only of women. The 40 Thieves, which was formed in the late 19th century and continued to operate until the 1960s, was a structured gang of shoplifters from South London. The gang was led by a woman known as Queen Maggie Hill, who was the sister of the famous gangster Billy Hill. Madame Manhattan. Queen Madame St. Clair, also known as Stephanie St. Clair or Madame Manhattan, was a French African woman who immigrated to America in 1912 through Marseille from Martinique. This woman, who had briefly collaborated with the 40 Thieves of New York, which was one of the oldest street gangs in New York, quickly turned to illegal gambling. She and her original partner, Ellsworth Johnson, agreed with 5 New York crime families, which meant the integration of St. Clair's gang into the Mafia Commission. In 1935, when one of the New York crime family's leaders was shot and injured, Madame St. Clair sent a telegram to him while he was in the hospital, saying, "What goes around, comes around."